Kingdom of Men, Chapter 6, Nikolat. Nikolat managed to maintain his composure throughout the brief event. The favor ceremony required that he sit in the chair beside his obnoxious brother, Bilex. His mother's throne was empty, and Demira was sitting in the throne beside hers. The royal families sat together, facing the crowd of favors with their families. When KaLeah walked in, he was captivated by her beauty and unable to take his eyes off the way her hips rocked from side to side as she walked toward him in that red dress. When she made eye contact, he imagined what it would be like if she were walking straight to him in an empty room. The vision was interrupted by his father's voice, and then Nikolat felt a surprising tinge of jealousy when that captain pinned the favor pendant onto KaLeah's dress. The ceremony was over quickly, and as soon as KaLeah's back was turned, he slipped out of his chair and out the back door of the throne room. He was never in the mood to stick around and talk to his family or their entitled friends. Walking through the corridors, his mind kept replaying KaLeah's walk down the aisle. She had looked pale and didn't have her usual confident air. It seemed to him that KaLeah wasn't excited at all. In fact, maybe even a little upset about her royal appointment to the favor position. Of course, that would be absurd. Since she was only a village girl, maybe she just didn't understand what was being gifted to her. Everyone in the kingdom wanted to be a favor, or part of a favor family at least. It was the next best thing to royalty. Her trepidation intrigued him. Why would anyone not be happy about this? He wondered. For him, it simply meant that he'd be seeing a lot more of KaLeah, which he liked. Nick made it to his room and removed his sword. He walked to his favorite chair next to the fireplace and poured himself a drink. It had been a long day, and the castle servants and guards had been going full force since the events of the morning ride. A sinister smile crept across his face as he remembered how he had taunted KaLeah, and then watched her slice through men like paper. Although he knew that she'd killed his sister's kidnappers just days ago, seeing her actually in battle was both enticing and unsettling. For one, he'd never seen a woman use a sword before, and second, she was capable of complicating his plans more than he'd anticipated. Not only would this girl be around his sister now more than ever, but she was lethal. He knew that most men would underestimate her after what he'd seen. Nikolat ran his fingers through his hair and pulled his hands down across his face. He was running out of ideas. He heard a knock, and the guards announced that Favor Lamone was waiting. "Enter," Nikolat called out. He did not want to see the wormy man, but he thought perhaps yelling at him might improve his mood in the long run. "Quite an interesting turn of events, wouldn't you agree, my prince?" Lamone said, as he helped himself to a drink and a seat in a plush, oversized chair opposite his own. "But don't worry, I'm sure Sarzo will think of something else. We obviously can't try a third kidnapping at this point, especially with that woodland warrior girl shadowing the princess." Nikolat stood up and began pacing across the room. Sarzo's name sent an angry tingle down his spine. Lamone kept talking about how ravishing KaLeah had looked, but Nick couldn't hear the rest. The anger had bubbled up into his inner ear, blurring out sound. He saw his sword where he'd laid it on a small table, grabbed it, and then walked back toward Lamone with the blade extended. "Whoa!" Lamone said, putting his hands out in front of him. His drink fell to the floor. "Tell Sarzo that he can do it on his own next time, without my help," Nikolat said. He swung the sword down across Lamone's left arm. It made a sound like a clap, and Lamone yelled, jumped up from the chair, and pulled his own sword from his belt. "I don't think you'll want me to tell Sarzo that," Lamone said, fending off another blow. "Tell him what you want," Nikolat said, trying to jab Lamone in the belly. "You don't know what you're saying," Lamone argued. "You're just mad that the plan was unsuccessful. The kidnappers failed, and now King Sarzo will be angry. Sarzo thought Amira would be an easy target. He may think differently now and come up with another strategy. Why didn't they go after my brother or Bilex first? Nikolat asked. The spirits know it would be easy to kill my lazy brother, as long as we could pull him away from kissing father's boots. It was easy the first time when Amira was out riding alone, Lamone said. No one expected her to be rescued by a traveler. And this second time, well, we didn't realize the farm girl would still be around. Now that she's a favor, we may never be rid of her. Nikolat could taste blood and realized he'd bitten his tongue. Lamone had told Nikolat all of King Sarzo's promises a year ago, and they had sounded great. King Sarzo of Exteli wanted an alliance with Belleron in order to ease trade between the two kingdoms. His land was on the rocky edge of the sea and not as fertile as Belleron lands. His plan was to orchestrate a kidnapping. King Sarzo's men would kidnap Amira, and the blame would fall on Lysodania because of the colors worn by the men. While everyone focused on finding Amira, Nikolat would let assassins into the castle to kill Bilex. Sarzo's men would then rescue Amira from Lysodania and return her to King Arezus. Grateful, King Arezus would then join alliances with King Sarzo instead of King Mikroth of Lysodania. Then Nikolat would be the sole heir to the throne of Belleron as the kingdom prepared for war with Lysodania. Once Lysodania was conquered, the lands would be divided between Belleron and Exteli. Nikolat had zero guilt about having his brother killed for the greater good of him becoming king. He told himself that a Belleron led by his brother would be a travesty. And now that the plan had not worked out, Nikolat didn't know if he could trust King Sarzo or Lamone. He didn't know if either man would keep any of their promises. This was all Lamone's fault, he thought. Nikolat ran at Lamone again with his sword. His sword met Lamone's and they fought. "What is this?" Lamone asked. "You're still on our side, right?" Nikolat didn't answer. "Sarzo won't try another attack like that," Lamone said. "The royal family is too well guarded, even against me. He'll have another plan soon, and then you'll be the only male heir." Nikolat tripped Lamone, and he fell to the floor. Nikolat kicked Lamone's sword away and pointed his own at Lamone's throat. Lamone squealed. "What's the matter with you?" Lamone asked. Nikolat was sick to his stomach. Deep inside, he wanted to just kill the sniveling man, but he knew he couldn't. Not now, not like this. There would be too many questions. He pulled his sword away and sheathed it. He walked to the bookshelf that concealed the entrance to a secret passageway. "Tell King Sarzo what you want," Nikolat said. "I'm still on his side, but I'm limiting my involvement. I'm not sure how I feel about an alliance with a king whose best men are defeated by a young girl from Arion. Now get out." Lamone scrambled up and out through the double doors. Nikolat was fuming. He was angry with Lamone, angry at King Sarzo and the failings of the kidnappers. He was attracted to and yet frustrated with the girl who had appeared out of nowhere to ruin his plans. He couldn't sit still, but he didn't want to be seen by anyone out in the castle either. After a few moments, Nikolat walked to a tall bookshelf against his wall. He lifted a lever tucked behind a book. There was a sound of gears shifting to open a hidden doorway. Nick slipped into a dark passageway to walk where he wouldn't be seen or disturbed. KaLeah. Captain Davin escorted Favor KaLeah all the way back to her new bedroom suite. She froze in the hallway, confused. I'm guessing that nobody told you about this part," Hilib said. "It was discussed between the king and General Zosef. Instead of a room down the hall, your chambers will now be adjoined to Princess Amira's. You will have access to passage directly connected to her room." He opened the door for her. "Valaire did tell me," she said. Her head was foggy and she felt like she was walking through mud. "I just forgot." "The nursemaids will have already moved your belongings and clothing to your new room. They should be along shortly to help you, change, miss." He turned away from her and she saw his cheeks had flushed a light pink color. She walked by him into the candlelit room. Her new room was twice as large as her last, with a round tub, mirrors, bay windows, and a sofa, in addition to luxurious chairs, curtains, and linens. All her new clothing was hanging in the tall wardrobe. She knew that the clothes she had arrived in were hanging there too, tucked in between the fancy new riding clothes. And beneath all the clothing she would find her boots, cleaned but well worn. She wondered what her father would think if he returned home to find her gone with no explanation, and felt a sharp pang in her chest. No one in the village would guess to look for her inside the Bellerone castle. She regretted not telling anyone, at least the direction she'd been heading. "You'll find that you have more clothing befitting a bodyguard now," Hilip said, coming up behind her. She realized that she was staring absently into the wardrobe. "You don't have to wear dresses around the castle if you do not wish to," he clarified. "You shall have considerably more access to weapons also. I can show you to the armory later if you'd like to choose additional weapons, daggers, or anything else." His kind eyes twinkled as he smiled at her. She realized that he was excited about her new position, or at least he was excited about something, maybe showing her the weapon selections. She watched him with more curiosity. She took a deep breath, relieved that at least she'd be more comfortably dressed in her new role. She pulled out a light gray tunic with a dark gray pattern that ran from the collar to the skirt, black pants over black boots, then pulled out a black double belt to secure the tunic. She laid it all over a nearby chair. "I admit, this is all more familiar than, well, this." She motioned to the dress she wore. "I had never even worn a dress before coming here." "If I may say so, you do look lovely in the dresses," Hilip said. He looked away quickly, seemingly embarrassed. KaLeah was surprised to find yet another smile curling at the edges of her lips. Smiling was not something she had expected to be mixed in with her heart being torn between finding her father and protecting the princess. "Before I leave you to change, favor KaLeah, I do need to discuss your new position with you." Captain Davin's voice had changed to a more formal tone. "So, what is it that I am to know, Captain Davin?" "You may call me Hilip in private, if it pleases you, favor KaLeah." "Only if you call me KaLeah," she responded. "I'm not a formal lady. I don't know what I am right now." "Well, KaLeah, you are the first woman bodyguard in the history of Bellerone, maybe in all of Naldash. You have been charged to protect our princess. From what has transpired thus far, I'd say you are the best person for this position." "Do you know why anyone would want to hurt her?" KaLeah asked. "Why do these men keep coming after her?" The captain shook his head. "I wish that I did. We are all working to try and uncover the plot and purpose, I assure you." A silence followed his words, and KaLeah realized how close they were standing. She quickly turned and walked to sit in front of the fireplace, which had been lit and well fed with wood. Hilip cleared his throat and then followed her, sitting in the companion chair beside her. "First, these orders come directly from the king and are to be followed precisely, unless he instructs otherwise," Hilip said. "As a favor and as a personal guard to the princess, your duty is to her safety in all things. You will be the first person she sees in the morning and the last in the evening. You will accompany her throughout the castle, and once it is again deemed safe enough, you will accompany her in the lawns and gardens." Hilip had been looking at KaLeah, but he paused and let his eyes drift to the flames in the hearth. "It is most unusual, however. You are also to begin training her to fight. This is not something to be discussed with anyone outside the royal family, the general, the other captains, or myself. Given the recent events, the king feels it may be necessary for her to learn how to defend herself, even while riding on a dragot." "The king wants the princess to know how to fight," KaLeah repeated. Hilip nodded. She turned to him. "But in secret?" Again, Hilip nodded. "The king has always been traditional, but after losing his wife, he is genuinely scared of losing his daughter too. He is willing to break tradition with you. He trusts you. He trusts that you can help make the princess strong enough to defend herself, if it should come to that ever again." KaLeah sighed long and deep and then fell back into the chair. "Oh, what a mess I've gotten myself into," she thought. Unable to leave, tied to a new responsibility and a princess, when all she wanted was to find her father and go home. Even growing up in the small village, she never longed for adventure beyond the woods, and yet adventure found her. "The nursemaids may be allowed in the princess's room, but no one else," Hilip continued. "There are to be guards stationed outside every room she is in. However, there are secret passageways built within the castle that only the royal family, the general, and some captains know about. You must learn these passageways and teach them to the princess. In case of attack, they lead to a secret chamber in the lower levels of the castle." "How am I to learn these passageways? Is there a map?" KaLeah asked. "No, lest it fall into the wrong hands," he replied. "A few times a week I will come to you after you have seen the princess safely to bed. I shall guide you through the passageways bit by bit until you know them by heart. There is a simple pattern, like following the left wall of a maze. The entrance from this room is behind your wardrobe. However, I wouldn't advise going in without me until you learn them thoroughly. There are still some areas deep in the castle that even I have never seen. I wouldn't want you to get lost." The smile on his lips met his eyes as he looked away from KaLeah into the wardrobe, then back to her. "Captain Hilip, why were you assigned to teach me? Is this something you normally do as part of your role?" Hilip smiled again and stood to leave. He nodded a slight bow to her and began to walk to the door. "I wasn't assigned, Favor KaLeah. I volunteered." KaLeah stood up more quickly than she'd intended, and she suddenly felt faint again. "Thank you for your escort and for the kindness," she managed to choke out. His cheeks flushed and he smiled wider. "It was my pleasure," he said, and he pulled the doors closed behind him. After Hilip left, the nursemaids came in and helped KaLeah slink out of her dress. They kindly put her into another sleeping gown and then left her alone in her new room. In the sudden quiet, KaLeah found herself staring at her wardrobe. Hilip had warned her not to go in without his instructions, but she could at least look beyond the entrance. She opened the tall wooden doors to her wardrobe, slid a pair of boots to the side, then pushed apart 2 rows of hanging clothes. She could see a light peeking through a long vertical line in the back. Assuming it was the outline of a door, she felt for a latch. Once she found it, she pulled, and the door swung into the passageway beyond. She was surprised to see that the path outside the door was candle-lit. The soft light flickers invited her into the quiet hallway. She climbed through her wardrobe and stepped into a stone tunnel that stretched to her left and right. The left was dark, but to her right, a small white candle sat flickering on the ground. If she stretched out her arms, she could touch both tunnel walls at the same time. If she reached way up, she could touch the ceiling. She decided to creep as far as the end of the light, checking behind her as she walked to make sure she kept her wardrobe entrance in sight. As she came nearer to the candle, she noticed another one flickering further down the tunnel. Her first instinct was to turn back. Someone has lit these candles recently, she realized. Who would be in the passageway lighting candles? It couldn't have been the captain, because he had just been with her. Princess Amira's room was in the other direction. Could someone be trying to lead me somewhere? Could it be a trap? The questions flooded her mind, and she knew that she should go back to her room, and yet she was too curious at this point. She wanted answers to the questions. KaLeah noticed how her body reacted to the small adventure. She was excited chasing the mystery, momentarily pushing all other cares from her mind. Her mood lifted as she followed the pathway of lit candles. The silence and solitude caused her mind to drift, and it took her inexplicably to thoughts of Nikolat. Since Amira's birthday, he'd been everywhere, watching her at the party, watching her at meals, and then suggesting the drag it ride. She wondered then, but only for a moment, why he had suggested that ride. Had it been a coincidence? She thought of the assassins and the attack. It had been the second attack on the princess and may not be the last. How am I supposed to protect this little girl? What if there are traitors among us? What if they know of the secret tunnels? KaLeah's heart started to beat faster as her mind brought her back around to her new responsibilities. The responsibilities she never asked for. Calm down, she told herself. She took a few steps and heard something behind her. Instead of turning around, she froze, straining to hear the sound again. Suddenly, there were two arms around her and a blade to her throat. The arms were strong and held her tightly. KaLeah didn't try to struggle. The man's body was pressed up against hers, and she felt him take a deep breath, as if breathing her in. Does he know who I am? What are you doing here? He asked. She instantly recognized the voice. Her heart started pounding, and she wondered why he didn't just let her go. She wasn't armed. Prince Nikolat? She asked. It's just me. Let go. What are you doing here outside my room? He asked again. His grip on her didn't slacken. She started to struggle and felt the prick of the blade. Thoughts flooded her mind. Was it really Nikolat? Or was he an assassin? Stalking the passageways, looking for the princess? No, it must be the prince. Maybe he thinks that I'm an assassin. I was following the candles, she said. I didn't know I was outside your room. She could feel Nikolat's grip loosen, and he lowered the knife. She took a deep breath, and he backed away from her. He still had hold of one of her arms. For a moment, she was afraid to turn around, afraid that it wouldn't be Nikolat. She turned around slowly and then stepped back. He was standing there in the candlelight, every flame accentuating his high cheekbones and piercing eyes. She quickly composed herself. You were going to kill me, she said. Maybe, if you had been anyone else. What are you doing in here? She asked. The damp air helps me clear my head, if you can believe it, he said with a smirk. I can be alone here. Besides, I don't feel much like going outside after the attack on Amira. He looked down at the knife in his hands, remorsefully. KaLeah noticed that his voice shook when he said the last part. She hadn't even thought about the attack bothering him. She was ashamed for thinking he might have had a hand in it, and embarrassed for raising her voice at him. He was a prince, after all, and she should be somewhat respectful. But then she remembered how he'd promised her to Lamon, and she narrowed her eyes at Prince Nikolat. I'm going to say good night and return to my room now, Your Majesty, she said, starting to leave, taking a step around him. He tightened his grip on her arm briefly, and then let her go. I'm sorry about Lamon, he said. She stopped dead in her tracks. She always had time for apologies. It's just, he started. I hoped that if I knew you were with another man, then... He stopped and seemed to take a strained breath. It would just be easier. Better. Easier for who? What in dragon's sake do you mean? She turned to face him. Easier for me, he said. He raised his eyes, and KaLeah's heart tightened in her chest. It would be easier for me if you were with someone else, KaLeah. KaLeah's thoughts couldn't keep up with his words. Easier for him if she was with someone else? What wasn't being said? Nikolat, I don't understand, she whispered. Something inside her belly stirred. She tried to tell herself that she only felt an inkling of desire because someone was expressing desire for her, and that had never happened before. KaLeah didn't know how to react. She had not been trained to ward off these kinds of enemies. Seduction, desire that blinds the senses. It clouds your reason, your mind, and distracts your body. She could just leave, she knew. But then he reached out and ran his fingers down her arm. He was slow and meticulous. Her skin pricked to life beneath each touch, and she wanted to surrender to him and run from him at the same time. Her feet wouldn't make up their mind. That hand was just holding a knife to my throat, she reminded herself, cursing the bumps beneath his touch that gave away her nerves. Nikolat, she said. But then, as if her own voice had woken her up, she turned her head away from him, looking at the candles leading back to her room, and began to pull away. But he stepped up behind her, and she couldn't move. He ran his fingers across the back of her shoulders to the nape of her neck. Then both hands moved down her arms. She could feel the butt of his knife, still in his hand, rub against the skin of her right arm. She was very aware of how thin her dressing gown was, and she could feel every movement as if he were pressed against her skin. KaLeah had never been touched like this. She closed her eyes as he wrapped his arms around her waist. He leaned in and began to breathe against her skin with warm, wet breath. KaLeah felt dizzy and lightheaded. She tried to think about Amira alone in her room. She tried to think about Lamone slinking around and cackling. Nikolat had almost given her away to Lamone. How could a man who wants you just give you away? He couldn't ever really love me, she told herself. She somehow managed to repeat that in her mind as she slowly pulled herself away from his hypnotic hold and forced herself to walk away. He won't love me. He can't love me. He can't love me. He won't ever love me, she told herself over and over again to the rhythm of her steps as she followed the lit candles back to her room. KaLeah, please, he called after her, but she kept walking. She knew where she was now and where she was going. She reached the passage door at the end of the candles and stopped suddenly, looking down at the candle on the floor. Had the one outside Nikolat's room been the last? Or had she been too distracted to see that they continued down the corridor? She couldn't remember. Why had the candlelit path begun outside of her door? She climbed back through the secret door in the back of the wardrobe and pulled it shut behind her. She found that the latch had a lever to lock the door, so she locked it. She closed the carved wardrobe doors and then leaned forward, resting her forehead against the wood. Closing her eyes, she could still picture Nikolat's face turned down to her with a longing expression, flames flickering reflections in his dark eyes. That may be the toughest enemy I'll ever have to face, she told herself. Then she pulled herself up and went to lie down with shivers still running up and down her spine.